The buzzing of flies clung to the still air, mingling with the bitter smell of sweat and hay under the crushing Texas sun. In the corner of an old horse shed on the edge of San Angelo, a young woman, no more than 23, was bound to a splintered post. The ropes cut deep into her wrists, leaving raw grooves where the flesh had bled in the heat. One eye was swollen shut, her cheeks still red from a slap that burned like fire, and her white dress hung torn at the shoulder and hip. She had been beaten, left to wilt in the dust like she wasn't even human. The summer of 1890 gave no mercy. Wind pushed dirt through the broken boards, coating her bruised skin, sticking to her torn dress. Her body trembled, not just from pain, but from a fear so heavy it sat like a stone in her chest. She had fought hard. You could read it in the rope burns on her arms and the raw scrapes on her knees from trying to stand, but now her strength was gone. Her breathing came shallow, her eyes fixed on the doorway, begging for anyone to come. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The men of the West knew violence. They'd seen hangings, gunfights, rustlers caught and shot without trial. But this was different. This was the face of innocence crushed by greed. Any man who ever held a daughter or loved a woman would have felt his stomach turn at the sight. And the question hung in the silence. Who could do this and why? That silence broke when John Carter stepped inside. 51 years old, a rancher marked by loss and hard years. John had carried more pain than most. But nothing prepared him for what he saw. His boots stopped cold, the sun outside seeming to dim. The world narrowed to one sight. A girl still alive, her tears unshed but burning in her eyes. He moved quick. The old knife slid from his belt, and with one clean pull he sliced through the ropes. Her knees gave out, but John caught her before she hit the ground. She was so light it felt wrong, her skin fevered from the sun, her body shaking like a colt just born. He carried her to his horse, laid her across the saddle with the care you'd give a wounded child, and mounted up. Each hoofbeat pounded heavier than the girl in his arms. By the time John reached his ranch, the sky burned crimson, the kind of color that warns of trouble. He brought her inside his small cabin, the smell of wood smoke and leather wrapping around them. He eased her into a chair and fetched water from the pump. She drank slow, her lips trembling against the tin cup, every swallow a fight against weakness. When her voice finally came, it was low and ragged. Her name was Sarah Hayes. Her father owned wide, rich land up in Wichita County, land a man named Mason Grady wanted for himself. Grady was rich and dangerous, the kind of man who thought money could buy anything. When Sarah's father refused to sell, Grady sent men to make him change his mind. They tied Sarah up, beat her, left her to rot under the sun. She was nothing but a pawn to break her father's will. John listened, his jaw tight as iron. He had known men like Grady, men who used fear as their brand, men who twisted the law till it screamed. But John also knew this land, this dirt under his boots, and he knew what it meant to stand your ground. The thought of Sarah's father forced to his knees, and Sarah used like bait churned his gut. Her eyes met his across the rough cabin table. They were swollen and tired, but there was still a spark in them. Pain hadn't broken her. And John realized saving her was only the first step. By cutting those ropes, he'd walked straight into a storm, and it was already gathering outside. As the lamps burned low, John heard the sound of boots on dirt. Slow, heavy, someone outside his door. The night pressed close around the cabin, too still for Texas. John knew his land like his own breath. The yip of coyotes, the creak of the windmill, the soft lowing of cattle in the dark. But this sound was different. Slow footsteps crunching in the dust. Someone had come looking. John's hand slid toward the old Colt resting on the table. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The girl in the chair, Sarah, felt it too. Her body stiffened as if the ropes had found her again. Her swollen, I darted toward the door, breath hitching in her chest. The door eased open with a groan. A man stood there, Mark Hanley. His crooked grin showed no shame, his eyes flat and cold, like a rattler sizing up prey. John didn't need an introduction. This was one of Mason Grady's men, the kind who didn't ask questions, just swung fists and tied knots. "I've come for the girl," Hanley said, like he was asking for a cup of sugar. Jean stood slowly, the boards under his boots sighing. He didn't raise his voice, didn't even flinch. The Colt hung steady in his hand, old but well kept. His silence made the room heavier than words ever could. Sarah found her voice first. It cracked, but carried enough strength to cut through the moment. "John, watch out," she shouted, just as Hanley lunged. Years on the ranch had carved John's muscles hard as mesquite. He slammed Hanley against the wall, the man's breath exploding out in a curse. They fought in the tight space, fists and elbows in a storm of wood splinters and grunts. John pinned him, anger and sweat burning through the struggle. Hanley tried to reach for his own gun, but John twisted his arm till the fight bled out of him like water in dry sand. Something slid from Hanley's coat, a thick packet of fresh bills. John didn't need to check the seal to know where they came from. Mason Grady's bank in Wichita County had been greasing palms with money just like this for years. Proof, plain as daylight. Sarah's face went pale, memories flashing hot. One of the men laughing while she was tied up, bragging that Grady would finally get what he wanted. Now she knew it wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. John stared down at Hanley, the man writhing like a snake under a boot. He felt something old rise in him, something heavy and dangerous. This wasn't about a stranger's daughter anymore. This was his ranch, his home, his fight now, too. Outside, the wind shifted. The smell of dust and heat pressed through the cracks. Trouble wasn't knocking. It had already walked through the door. John didn't sleep a wink that night. He sat by the window, his rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the line where the land met the dark sky. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and sweat. Sarah dozed fitfully in the chair by the fire, her breathing uneven, her face still marked by bruises but showing a quiet strength that refused to break. Just before dawn, John heard it, the distant roll of hoofs. Not one horse, but several. The sound was like thunder carried on dry wind, drawing closer with every beat. He stood, chambered around, the click echoing in the silent cabin. Sarah woke with a start, eyes wide. She didn't need to ask what was coming. They both knew Mason Grady wouldn't stop with one hired thug. 3 riders appeared on the horizon, black shapes against the bleeding light of morning. They came steady, not in a rush, men who thought they owned whatever ground they stood on. When they reined up outside the ranch, dust swirled around their boots. They carried torches and cans of kerosene, the kind of tools that could turn a lifetime of work into smoking ash in minutes. One called out, his voice flat and sharp. "Bring the girl out, Carter. No need to make this hard." John stepped onto the porch, rifle steady, his shadow stretching long in the rising sun. His voice stayed low, but it carried weight. "This land's not yours to take, and she's not yours to claim." For a long breath, nobody moved. The silence was so tight, it made Sarah's heart hammer in her chest. Then everything snapped. A torch flew through the air, hitting a pile of hay with a hiss and a burst of flame. Sarah didn't think. She grabbed a bucket of water and threw it over the fire, the steam rising sharp. At that same instant, John squeezed the trigger. The first rider crumpled, his torch tumbling to the dirt. The second man drew fast, but John swung and fired again, dropping him before his shot even cleared the barrel. The third rider tried to circle, spurring his horse hard. Sarah snatched up a broken beam from the porch and hurled it with everything she had. The horse reared, throwing the rider to the ground. He scrambled to his feet, cursing before running for the brush, shouting promises of vengeance. The air was thick with dust and gun smoke. The smell of burned hay and kerosene stung their noses. 2 men lay groaning on the ground, one slipping in and out of consciousness. John stood breathing hard, rifle warm in his hands, his heart pounding steady as a drum. Sarah looked at him, her chest rising fast, not with fear this time, but with something deeper, something she couldn't name. And while they stood there, catching their breath, word of the fight was already traveling on the wind. Mason Grady would hear, and he wouldn't take it kindly. By mid-morning, John had dragged Mark Hanley and the 2 wounded riders into town, roped together like cattle headed for the pen. Dust clung to their clothes, and blood marked the trail they left behind. Sarah rode beside him on his old sorrel mare, her hands gripping the saddle horn, her jaw set tight. She hadn't asked to come, but John could see in her eyes she needed to face this. She wasn't going to hide. When they rolled in the main street of San Angelo, folks stepped out of doorways and off boardwalks. Men paused with coffee cups halfway to their lips. Women holding laundry baskets stopped in their tracks. People who had once looked away when Mason Grady's name came up now stared, their eyes sharp, their whispers spreading fast. John dismounted slow, rifle slung across his shoulder. He hauled Hanley down by the collar, shoving him hard enough to make him stumble. "Where's the sheriff?" John called, voice rough. A few seconds later, Sheriff Tom Danner stepped out of his office, hat pulled low, badge glinting in the sun. His face tightened when he saw the bundle of cash John tossed at his boots. Fresh bills stamped with Grady's bank seal. "That enough proof for you?" John asked, his voice low but carrying through the street. The sheriff bent, picked up the packet. His jaw worked like a man chewing on a nail. Hanley, wild-eyed and hurting, spat blood and words in equal measure. "You think you're a hero, Carter? Grady's gonna grind you into dust. You heard that worthless land. None of it matters. Money talks, old man." But this time, the street didn't stay quiet. A storekeeper, skinny, gray-haired, with calloused hands, stepped forward. "Grady bled me near dry," he said, voice shaking. "Put me in debt for a wagon he knew I couldn't pay off. Sent men to break my windows when I fell behind." Then a widow spoke up, her voice louder. "He sent those same thugs to run me off my land after my husband died. Said a woman couldn't hold property." One by one, voices joined in, anger rising like floodwater breaking a dam. The silence that had kept Grady's power alive cracked wide open. People who had feared him for years suddenly weren't afraid anymore. By noon, the whole town was moving up the hill toward Grady's big house. It gleamed white in the sun, fine shutters, big porch, a place built on other people's sweat. John walked near the front, Sarah close by, her face pale but determined. Grady tried to shut his doors, try to hide behind hired guns. But fear's a thin shield when the truth's out in the open. The townsfolk weren't carrying fancy rifles or polished pistols, just pitchforks, old shotguns, and grit. And that was enough. The crowd dragged Grady down his own porch steps. His fine coat tore, his pale face twisting in rage as he shouted for order, for respect. But nobody listened anymore. Justice didn't wear a judge's robe that day. It wore the hands of ordinary men and women who had had enough. John didn't cheer. He just stood there, rifle across his chest, watching Sarah. Her eyes weren't on Grady. They were on her father, Henry Hayes, as he rode hard into town with a wagon, dust flying behind him. He leapt down before the wheels even stopped, his weathered face carved deep with sleepless nights. When Sarah ran into his arms, the crowd went quiet for a heartbeat. "Sarah, thank God," Henry choked out, holding her like he'd never let go again. John looked away for a moment, giving them the space they needed, though his throat tightened at the sight. When Henry turned to John, words failed him. He gripped John's hand hard, rough palm to rough palm. A thank you that didn't need speaking. Grady's power crumbled that afternoon. His money couldn't buy him safety anymore. He lost everything, his land, his fearsome name, and the town's silence. But when the dust settled and the crowd drifted home, it was quiet again, too quiet. Sarah climbed onto her father's wagon, ready to go back to Wichita County. She turned in the seat, her bruised face softer now, eyes lingering on John. There was gratitude there, but something else too, something neither of them dared put into words. John tipped his hat, just a faint smile on his lips. He didn't speak, and maybe that silence was heavier than anything he could have said. Was it goodbye, or the start of something neither of them yet understood? The sun was dropping when John rode back to his ranch alone. The place felt different now, quiet but not peaceful. The porch boards creaked under his boots, and the smell of gunpowder still clung to the air. He leaned his rifle by the door and sat heavy in the old chair outside, staring across the dry pasture. The fight in town had ended, but John knew men like Mason Grady didn't quit. Losing his power wouldn't make him humble. It would make him dangerous. The kind of man who'd rather burn the whole world down than admit he'd been beaten. Sarah's face kept coming back to him. The look in her eyes when she'd left with her father. It wasn't just thanks. It was trust. The kind that lays a weight on a man's shoulders heavier than any sack of grain. Night came slow. Coyotes yipped far off, and the windmill groaned against the breeze. John lit a lamp and sat at the table, turning Grady's money over in his hands. It was dirty, and not just from the dust. Men had bled for this cash. Men had hurt Sarah to get more of it. John hated the feel of it on his skin. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. John reached for the Colt on the table before opening it. To his surprise, it wasn't Trouble standing there. It was Sarah. She'd come back without her father, riding that old mare down the long road under the moonlight. Her face was tired, her dress dusty again, but her eyes steady. "Pa's safe now," she said quietly. "But I couldn't leave like that. Not without thanking you proper." John stepped aside to let her in. The lamp light touched her bruises, but it also showed the sparks still burning under them. She sat at the table, fingers tracing the wood grain, not quite meeting his eyes. "Grady won't forget what you did," she said. "He'll come back for you." John gave a small shrug, rough hands resting flat on the table. "Let him try. I've been standing my ground a long time." There was a silence between them, not heavy, just real. Outside, the wind rustled the grass. Sarah looked up then, holding his gaze longer than before. "You didn't have to save me," she said, voice low. "But you did, and I won't forget that." John nodded once, words caught somewhere deep in his chest. He wasn't a man who talked much about feelings, not even to himself. But in that quiet room, it felt like something had shifted. Before she left, Sarah paused in the doorway. "If you hear trouble, send word," she said. "Pa and I won't stand by." John tipped his hat, watching her ride away in the moonlight. Alone again, he sat back down, staring at the Colt on the table. The fight wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones. Trouble was still coming, and when it did, it would knock first. The next few days stretched long and uneasy. The ranch sat quiet under the hot Texas sun, but John knew that kind of quiet, the kind that comes before a storm. He kept busy fixing fences, hauling water, moving cattle to higher ground, but his mind was never still. Every creak of the windmill, every crow calling from the fence posts made his hand twitch toward the Colt on his hip. Sarah's visit kept replaying in his head. She'd looked him in the eye like no one had in years, not afraid, not asking anything, just seeing him. He didn't like admitting it, but that stuck with him harder than the sound of gunfire. On the third night, the moon was high when John heard it again, hooves in the distance. Not many this time, just one horse. He set his coffee cup down, heart beating steady but hard, and stepped onto the porch with the rifle slung loose in his hands. A rider came into view, but it wasn't Sarah or her father. It was Sheriff Tom Danner. The lawman swung down from his horse, his face drawn tight, dust clinging to his coat. "Evening, John," he said quietly. "Mind if I step in?" Inside, the sheriff didn't sit right away. He looked around the cabin like he was checking for ghosts. Finally, he said, "Grady's not done. Lost his land, his men scattered, but he's still got money hidden somewhere. Word is he's buying new guns out of state. He wants payback." John's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. Figured as much. Men like him don't take losing kindly. Sheriff Danner scratched his chin. "You save that girl. Folks in town are talking. They see you as the kind of man who doesn't scare easy. But Grady ain't coming after the town. He's coming after you." John didn't answer right away. He just stared into the flame of the oil lamp. Finally, he said, "Then I'll be ready." The sheriff nodded, like that was all he expected to hear. He put a hand on John's shoulder as he left. "You watch yourself, Carter. I've buried enough good men out here." When the door shut and the hoofbeats faded, the cabin felt colder than before. John sat at the table, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. This wasn't just about him anymore. Grady was mean enough to go after anyone close to him, even Sarah and her father. The next morning, John saddled up and rode north, dust trailing behind like smoke. He reached the Hayes Ranch by midday. The place was wide and green, but the worry in Henry Hayes's eyes showed plain as the fences running along the pasture. Sarah came out of the barn, surprise flashing in her face before it softened into something warmer. "You shouldn't have come," Henry said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "If Grady's after you, it's safer we don't get tied up in it." John shook his head. "It's too late for safe. He's not going to stop. He's angry enough to make this personal, and I won't have him using you two to get to me." Sarah stepped closer, her voice steady. "Then we stand together. Pa's got friends up here who hate Grady as much as you do. You don't have to fight this alone." John looked at her, then at Henry, and saw something he hadn't seen in years, a family willing to share the risk, to draw a line in the dirt and hold it. It lit a spark in him, the same one that had carried him through war, drought, and loss. That night they sat around the Hayes kitchen table, talking long after the lamps burned low. Plans were made, extra rifles cleaned, horses kept ready to ride. Sarah watched John as he spoke in that calm, even voice of his, laying out what to do if Grady came for them. She wondered how a man so weathered, so worn by life, could still carry that kind of quiet strength. When John finally saddled up to head home, Sarah walked him out to the gate. The night air was cool, the sky full of stars. For a moment they just stood there. She touched his arm lightly, her voice softer now. "You're not alone in this, John. Don't forget that." He tipped his hat, gave her a faint smile, then rode off into the dark. But as the sound of his horse faded, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness he was riding into wasn't just the night. The wind turned dry and sharp 2 nights later. John knew something was wrong before he even saw anything. His cattle were restless, moving in the dark, snorting and stamping at the dust. The moon was a thin, silver line, just enough light to see the shapes of the hills. John kept his rifle close as he made his rounds, every sense awake. Close to midnight, a shot cracked through the quiet. Not at the ranch, but somewhere near the road leading north. John swung into the saddle without a second thought, the old sorrel mare pounding over the hard ground as if she felt the danger too. When he reached the Hayes Ranch, he saw it right away. The barn doors hung open, lanterns knocked over, smoke curling out into the night air. Henry Hayes stood outside, a shotgun in hand, but his shoulders sagged. Sarah came running from the house, her hair loose, her face pale. "They came fast," Henry said, voice ragged. "4 of them, masked, took a few shots, then ran when I fired back. But they weren't here for me. They were trying to scare her." His eyes shifted towards Sarah. John dismounted slow, jaw tight. "This wasn't just a warning," he said. "Grady's telling us he can reach anywhere, anytime." Sarah's voice trembled, but she didn't back down. "Then let him come. We're not running." John looked at her, proud but worried. He knew fear when he saw it, even hidden under anger. She was brave, but bravery doesn't stop bullets. By dawn, John had ridden back to his place, but not alone. Henry and Sarah came with him, bringing what little they needed. If Grady wanted a fight, John wasn't going to let him pick them off one by one. The ranch felt tighter now, every shadow a threat, every sound outside a warning. The 3 of them worked through the day, stacking supplies, boarding windows, checking rifles. Sarah helped without complaint, her hands blistered by the end, but she never stopped. John caught himself watching her more than once. Not because of her beauty, though it was there even under the bruises, but because of her grit. She reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago, someone who never gave up no matter how hard life hit. Late that afternoon, Sheriff Dana rode in again. "Got word Grady crossed the state line with 2 hired guns," he said grimly. "He's coming tonight or tomorrow. Might be more with him. You folks need to clear out while you can." John shook his head. "This is my land. If I run once, I'll spend the rest of my life running." Sarah stepped forward before Henry could speak. "We stay too. This isn't just your fight, John. It's ours now." The sheriff looked at all 3 of them like they were crazy, but he knew arguing wouldn't change a thing. He just tipped his hat. "Then I hope you're ready." As night fell, an uneasy calm settled over the ranch. The lamps were kept low, windows shuttered tight. John sat at the table, cleaning his Colt piece by piece. Sarah moved around the cabin, quiet, setting out extra rounds, filling a pot with water in case fire came. Henry sat by the door with his shotgun across his knees, eyes sharp. Hours passed, thick and slow. Then, just past midnight, the dog started barking. A moment later, horses approached, 3, maybe 4, maybe more. Boots hit the ground outside, soft but certain. Voices whispered in the dark. John stood, rifle in hand. "Stay behind me," he said low. Sarah nodded but grabbed Henry's arm, refusing to move too far back. Through the cracks in the shutters, they saw the faint glow of lanterns and the gleam of guns. This time Grady hadn't sent boys to scare them. He'd come himself, and he'd brought hell with him. The first shot split the night before anyone spoke. Wood splintered off the porch beam, and Henry fired back through the open window. The sound of gunfire rolled across the land, sharp and mean, like thunder that wouldn't quit. Horses screamed outside, and men shouted orders. John stayed low, steady, moving from window to door, his rifle flashing fire each time he squeezed the trigger. He didn't waste bullets. Every shot was deliberate. Sarah kept her head down, but refused to hide. She reloaded for her father, her hands quick and sure despite shaking. "Mason," John shouted into the night. "This is between you and me. Don't drag others into it." A cold voice came back through the dark. "You think you can make a fool of me, Carter? I'll burn you out, take this land, and no one will stop me." A lantern sailed toward the barn, shattering into flame. Sarah bolted toward the door, but John caught her arm. "I'll handle it," he said, eyes hard. He slipped out the back, keeping low, and doused the fire before it caught, smoke stinging his throat. A shadow moved near the corral. John raised his rifle, but froze when he saw Mason Grady himself, stepping forward with a pistol, face twisted with rage. "You're done, old man," Grady spat. "This land's mine." "Not today," John said quietly. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, just leveled his rifle. The standoff lasted only a second before both men fired. Grady's bullet tore into the porch beam. John's shot hit true. Grady dropped to his knees, the pistol falling from his hand. The men who'd come with him broke and ran, leaving their boss bleeding in the dirt. Sheriff Danner arrived minutes later, drawn by the sound of the fight. He found John standing over Grady, rifle lowered but eyes still sharp. Henry and Sarah came out, smoke on their clothes, tired but unharmed. "It's over," the sheriff said, taking Grady into custody. "You'll answer for every crime you've paid for." By morning, word spread fast. Folks from town rode out to the ranch, bringing water and bread, clapping John on the back, thanking him for standing up when so many had been afraid. For the first time in years, people spoke openly about Grady's threats and schemes. The law finally had more than enough to hold him. When the crowd left and the land grew quiet again, Sarah stood with John by the corral, watching the sun rise over the hills. Her bruises were fading, but her spirit was as strong as ever. Henry loaded their wagon to head home, but Sarah lingered a moment longer. "You didn't just save me," she said softly. "You reminded people not to be scared anymore." John looked at her, tipping his hat with a faint smile. "Wasn't just me. Folks just needed someone to show him they still had a choice." She stepped closer, her voice warm. "Still, thank you. For everything." John didn't say much. He never did. But as he watched her climb into the wagon and ride off with her father, his chest felt lighter than it had in years. The ranch was safe, but more than that, the fear that had hung over the town was gone. Maybe that was the real victory. Money can't buy respect. Power built on fear crumbles the moment people stand together. Courage isn't loud. It's steady, like an old hand on a rifle when the night turns dangerous. And love. Well, love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits quietly, like a sunrise over the Texas plains, promising there's still more ahead. John turned back toward the cabin, the smell of smoke still lingering in the air, but the sky clear and wide. For the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next.